Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I've got a really interesting young man to introduce you today. Julian Wells is his name. He is the co-founder of an organization called the Student Housing Initiative. It's an organization that researches how students make housing decisions and shares insights with real estate lenders and politicians to shape the new housing projects and policies. Since early 2023, the Student Housing Initiative has been involved in the approvals of more than 4,500 housing units and has given away $8,000 in grants to students. This spring, Julian was recognized for his work as the youngest member of the 2024 class of BC Business Magazine's 30 Under 30. Congratulations for that, Julian.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you so much for having me.
And you've written some pieces recently that I've had the privilege of reading in regards to this housing initiative and the studies that they've done. And I thought it was really provocative given, the housing crisis that we're in, particularly as it relates to young people not being able to afford homes. And what Julian is suggesting is even more difficult for students. I've heard stories of people renting beds in Mississauga. I'm not sure if that's actually true, but that's sort of the rumor that I hear is they're not even renting rooms, but they're renting beds in establishments. Maybe those are foreign students. I don't know, but whatever it is, it's pretty crazy. So, Julian, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So, tell me a little bit about how you got involved in the student housing initiative.
Yeah, absolutely. So my engagement in, housing in general just kind of kicked off in the last 2.5 years. I just recently graduated from the University of Victoria on the West Coast out in BC. And I was super interested in the housing space. Obviously, with the housing crisis going on, I myself was having trouble finding a place to live. And I really was looking for a class at UVic, just something I could turn to learn. And there wasn't anything like that. So a group of my friends and we co-founded something called the UVic Real Estate Club to basically create a space for ourselves to learn about housing and connect with people in the industry. As we got more involved with that, we recognized just how politicized the housing industry is and how big of an issue housing is for everyone across Canada. And we started to get involved with sort of public hearings. We started to get involved and share our opinions and our thoughts and anecdotes about kind of what students are going through in the housing market. And to add with what you were saying about students renting beds, I actually know a student in Victoria who rented a backyard to pitch a tent and was using the inside washroom and kitchen, but they were renting a backyard to pitch a tent. They weren't
No,
even living
no,
in a
you're
bed.
kidding me. Seriously?
No, genuinely, it's brutal. Across the country, there's hundreds of stories like this, I'm sure, but
So,
ridiculous.
so tell me about this report that you've come out with.
Absolutely. So we just launched at the end of June a report that talks about the research that we did earlier this year. We surveyed 650 students across Canada at, I believe, 9 or 10 universities in Calgary, Kelowna, Toronto, Vancouver, and Victoria. So five of the cities that are really experiencing some of the most challenging housing climates. And we really tried to get like a diverse perspective of what matters to students. And I think the big takeaway for us is that students have genuinely very unique perspectives, right? Students as an organization or as a demographic, they're not monolithic. They have so many different perspectives. They come from different backgrounds. But the one thing that came together for them, the one commonality was that every single decision that students are making in the housing market is to try to cut costs. Yet, despite that, more than 60% of them can't afford their rent every month, which is a shocking statistic and really concerning.
Uh, how are they how are they dealing with the situation? What are people doing other than renting backyards? What are people doing?
Yeah, absolutely. They're really just trying to cut costs however they can. They're taking on multiple roommates. They're asking their parents for help with tuition, with rent, whatever they can do. In plenty of cases, they're taking on debt as well. But that's the reality. Despite all of this, students are still unable to afford their house, despite how much help they're receiving. I think we have 60% of students who are getting help from family. Like 95% of students are wishing to or end up living with more than one person or end up living on their own, end up living not on their own. It's a
But
struggle out there.
haven't students always not lived on their own? I understand that, one of the biggest trends in the United States hasn't really taken off in Canada yet to the extent, but it's sort of co-living where you end up having a kitchen and a living room, but then you end up having, three or four bedrooms that are lockable, that are separate suites that are there, sort of like the old student residences of yesteryear. Is that the solution?
It's certainly possible. That's one of the questions we asked in our research process was, is that something students would be interested in? Would they be interested in living in sort of dorm style housing off campus in that sort of co-living format? And more than 50% of students said yes, which kind of indicates to us that, they are willing to live with other people, but really what it comes down to is cost. And what we've seen as well, one of the other questions we asked is kind of how many roommates do you live with, and how many people would you actually like to live with if cost wasn't a concern? And interestingly, students are living with way more students or way more roommates than they would actually like to if the cost wasn't a factor for them. So that tells us that students wish they could live in smaller units. They wish they could live with only one or two roommates. Yet, because of the cost of monthly rent, they're forced to live with three or four others or even more.
So, I guess I'm not surprised that the vast majority think that affordability is the number one issue and cost is the number one issue. That most live with roommates, either one or two or three roommates. I was surprised in your survey that the amenity of choice that's the biggest decision is laundry.
Absolutely. I think it really reflects that, when you're looking at a place to live, in-suite laundry has become that go-to for students. They don't want to be going down the block. They don't want to be going to another communal laundry facility in the community. They want to be able to stay in their apartment in their home and do it there.
Most of them don't want to live on campus.
Yeah, I think that was I think last year. So this is our second iteration of the survey. Last year we surveyed about one third of the students we did this year, and we only surveyed Toronto, Vancouver, and Victoria. But when we did this for the first time, I think that was really the most shocking statistic for us is that students really maybe they want to live on campus in the first year, but afterwards they want to go off and live on their own and experience that independence. And I think that's kind of contrary to what a lot of universities are investing in. I mean, I think they're super focused in building on-campus housing, which as they should be, in my opinion. We need tons more student housing, not just on campus, but off campus as well. But this desire from students to live off campus really indicates to me that we need to be building more housing for students off campus that is actually purpose built for students, that they are the end user. Because the reality is, in such a competitive market landscape like we're facing right now, students who are perhaps competing against full-time or adults with a full-time job making like $80,000 a year, what landlord is going to choose a student over an adult making $80,000 a year, right? So students need to have that opportunity to compete more fairly and more equitably in the rental market.
I was a little bit surprised with your statistic about where people want to move. A lot of cities want to have universities because they think that when they attract students, the students will stay and create businesses and take jobs and create families and grow their community. You've got sort of one third will stay, one third will leave, and one third have no idea. So there doesn't appear to be like you, a lot of people going to Victoria and stay in Victoria. They go and then they leave.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I'm probably a decent example. I'm from Toronto originally. I grew up here and then decided to move across the country to study in Victoria because I wanted to experience the weather and the climate in BC. And I've loved it out there, but quite frankly, whether or not I'll stay is very dependent on the job opportunities that exist in that market and on housing as well. I think that's what we saw in our survey is that every single market, it's primarily job opportunities that are dictating where students decide to move. We've had students, like anecdotally, I've heard a lot of students, people my age say, I want to move to Calgary because I feel like that's where I can most sustainably buy a home. But as Calgary continues to take on more people and get more expensive, buying a home is only going to get harder.
I was surprised when you survey only 6% of the people wanted to go to Calgary, 25% to Toronto, 8% to Vancouver, and 60% places other than the biggest three cities. Where are they all going?
Really just random places around the country. I think because we gave students the opportunity to essentially input wherever they wanted to live, there's a lot of different places in there. Some students, I would say there's a large, not a huge percentage, maybe 5 to 10% are looking at moving to the United States. That was an interesting piece to pull out, given some of the news right now in that space. Yeah, I mean, I think realistically, there's just a lot of different places that students wish to move, and that kind of reflects what I said at the start. It's a very diverse group of people who have diverse interests, diverse needs, and backgrounds.
Versus when I was graduating, people were thinking about suburbs with cars. It would appear that walkability in a community is the number one amenity, what the lifestyle requests that your respondents said. And what they want is a free transit pass. And they want restaurants and grocery stores near them. Do you think that the current generation are looking for something different than my generation was looking for and where they want to live?
I think absolutely. I mean, I think generally, like speaking sort of holistically for the entirety of Canada, I think people are changing the perspective on what a city looks like and how we construct and city build and create density. And I think generally speaking, density will continue to increase. And with that, students' perspectives have changed over the years and I think have evolved to be less dependent on cars and perhaps more interested in walking or taking transit to their destination. I think that whole concept of a 15-minute city has really had a lot of investment and interest from young people and will continue to do so as they age out of university and get into their careers.
What a fascinating survey that you've done. We're going to take a break for some messages and be back in just 2 minutes with Julian Wells, who is this uh, real catalyst behind the Student Housing Initiative, an organization that researches how students make housing decisions and shares insights with all of us in regards to real estate and politics, in regards to what students need and what students want. Stay with us, everyone. We'll be back in just 2 minutes with Julian Wells. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Interesting conversation tonight with Julian Wells. He is the co-founder of a student housing initiative organization. It's an organization that researches how students make housing decisions, and he's just come out with a very substantial report of over 100 pages of the results of his research in regards to students. We've talked to Julian a little bit about the things that I found interesting. What did you find interesting about the report? Maybe some initiatives, some issues that we haven't talked about so far.
Yeah, absolutely. We already touched on just how much students are really struggling to be able to afford their rent. And I kind of wanted to underscore that a little bit and just touch on the fact that more than 60% of students' families are helping with the cost of living or tuition in some capacity. Yet, despite that many people receiving help, there's still 60% of students that can't afford their monthly rent, which tells you that if families weren't able to help, if that many families were unable to provide support, students would really be in a much more difficult position. And I think that sort of that dynamic between generations is a very interesting point to kind of take note of as we look at the student housing market as kind of an asset class that we'd like to see more investment in the future. Because I'm very much of the opinion that as we see a lot of demand in the space, we need supply to match that. Supply, in my opinion, is the housing lever that will start to unlock affordability over time. And I think that's a kind of a good point to note is that students are able to afford their rent every month, even though it's so expensive, or they're able to make do as much as they might struggle with it because of familial support. And to me, that means that this asset class is very underserved and there's tons of opportunity.
You're a political science and economics major from the University of Victoria. How do you think the governments, BC, Ontario, Canada, are dealing with this issue?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think BC's done a great job so far, in my opinion, of trying to throw as many different policies as they can at this issue and tried to sort of take essentially make progress, make slight progress with each policy in the hopes that it'll be a collective effort of all the policies that kind of make a push towards affordability. I think Canada's also done a good job over the last 8 to 12 months of starting to address that more. I think specifically in the student space, the announcement of offering lower cost loans to student housing operators and developers as well as institutions is something that could move the needle if executed correctly. But what we'd really like to see more of is opportunities opened up for private developers to work closely with universities, because oftentimes universities have limited resources to do things on their own. So bringing in partners to make that a reality can sometimes sort of smooth it out and actually move the needle when it comes to housing.
The last federal budget really talked about housing as being sort of a critical responsibility. Do you think they've done enough?
I honestly don't think we can figure that out yet. I think, every single policy that comes forward is kind of a swing, and we won't know if it's a hit or a miss until we see the effects of it a couple weeks and months and years down the line. I'd honestly like to see, moving to the topic of Ontario. I know you mentioned them in addition to BC and Canada. I'd like to see Ontario do more. I would like to see Ontario sort of follow suit with what BC have done and launch similar programs to that of BC Builds, launch opportunities that kind of take a multifaceted approach at this problem, because to me, there's really no one thing that's going to solve this crisis. We need a variety of different kinds of housing, a variety of different kinds of policies, support from private sector, public sector. We need so much to make this problem go away over time.
The size of condominiums, of apartments, has gone down fairly dramatically over the years, with some apartments now having below 300 square feet of space. What did you find out about space?
Absolutely. I think, one of the key statistics that we pulled out is that students are willing to live in small spaces. They are interested in living on their own or with just one roommate. It's all about cost for them. So if decreasing the size so that developers can make projects pencil in such a challenging macroeconomic landscape like the one we're facing right now, if that's what they need to do, then that's feasible as long as it does actually bring down costs for the end user. That's really what we're seeing. That's kind of the big driving factor for students is they're willing to live wherever it takes, quite frankly, as I mentioned, living in a backyard and pitching a tent, just to be able to attend university. It's realistically, as long as students are able to afford it, they don't really care where they're living.
A lot of people in the last little while have been blaming foreign students and this massive influx of foreign students to private universities and regular universities as being one of the reasons why we've had a lack of supply, actually too much demand, and that we didn't plan for that. What do you think of that issue?
I think generally speaking, looking at immigration and foreign students coming into the country and using that as like a factor or a reason to complain about the lack of supply or a reason why we have a lack of supply, to me, it's kind of the opposite, right? We should be using immigration, which we absolutely need to continue to grow our economy and our GDP over the next couple of years. We absolutely need immigration. We absolutely need foreign students. And a lot of times universities are like they're using foreign students in their tuition as a method to subsidize the tuition of those who live in Canada. So I think instead of looking at this as a reason of, okay, these people are the reason that we're not having enough supply, I disagree with that notion. I think people coming into this country should be set up for success, and we need to be doing that by using immigration, using foreign students as a reason to justify increases in supply. We see that people want to come to Canada. We want to welcome them in. So we need to make sure that we create enough housing to set them and everyone who's living in Canada right now up for success. So that's really the way I see it.
Interesting point of view. Different than what you hear in a lot of the mainstream media. So I congratulate you on that point of view, and would argue that you should talk about it a little bit more because I think it's a minority view right now, but I happen to agree with you. So go for it. I don't know, you're a political science major, so maybe you followed the current UK election. The chancellor, or the new chancellor of the exchequer, came out with a major speech just this past week about how she's going to, from a federal standpoint, national standpoint, override a lot of the local planning rules and make it easier and quicker to build housing. In BC, the premier has done some of that, where the BC premier, the BC government, is overriding some of the local planning, rights, rules, regulations, etc. Hasn't really happened in Ontario. What do you think of that? Is that a role of the national government to the provincial government to see housing as so critically important that they actually override some of the local planning and zoning regulations?
I think it's a tricky balance. I think it's to a certain extent a slippery slope, and as soon as we start to get federal governments involved in municipal affairs, I think we have to be very careful with how we're engaging there, because realistically, the municipal governments do have a better handle on what's going on in those smaller scale communities. But when it does come to housing, I think absolutely at this stage of our housing crisis, it makes sense, and it's something that you can absolutely justify and you can get behind it because we've seen young people and people of all ages struggling with housing for years now. And, we need to find a solution. So if there are communities that aren't moving the needle when it comes to building supply and starting to see some sort of impact on affordability, then you know what? Maybe involvement from federal government or provincial governments is what it needs, is what it takes. And I think realistically, like I mentioned earlier, throwing a bunch of different things at the wall and taking different policies on to try to see what sticks is kind of the efforts that governments need to be doing right now. We're at that point in the housing crisis where CMHC is indicating that, to reach affordability, we need to build 3 million more units by 2030. We have to look at ourselves and say, how are we going to actually make that happen? And quite frankly, I don't know that that's something that's going to happen organically unless we see some sort of push from federal and provincial governments to make municipal governments kind of take note.
Well, I think we're building something like 20 or 30% of that target. So we're digging a hole even worse than we've got already. So I think it is
Absolutely.
a substantial target, and that 3.5 million was incremental to what was currently being built. That CMHC came up with 1.5 to 1.8 in just Southern Ontario alone. Um, so we've got a big problem. You called it a housing crisis. I think a lot of people would agree with you. And I come back to my question, if that's the case, are we doing enough?
Absolutely not. At this stage, we're not doing enough. We need to be doing more. Like I mentioned, I think Ontario needs to be doing more. I think for me, housing is the biggest issue in this country right now, and it's threatening our future when it comes to how young people are making how young people are making decisions. We have people who are choosing where they're going to university. Remember, when you're thinking about going to school somewhere, you should be thinking about what's the best education you're going to get, how to set yourself up best for the future. We have students who are making decisions about where they're going to school based on not even just where they can afford to live, because they know it's going to be a struggle to afford to live anywhere in Canada, based on where they can find a place to live. It's that lack of availability that to me signals that we need to be doing more for students and we need to be doing more for housing in general in Canada.
So let's stay with students just for one last minute. Universities themselves, are they doing enough in building student housing on campus?
I mean, I think again, it's a tough dynamic, and there's kind of two different sides to the coin here. On one part, I think a lot of universities have continued to develop and build more on campus, and I think that's great. But there are also a lot of challenges that are facing them and that are making it challenging for them to do so. I think access to financing and zoning regulations is a challenge. I mean, I'm most educated on sort of how this works in Victoria and BC, but universities like SFU and the University of Victoria are very different from UBC, which kind of acts as like its own municipality and can essentially approve whatever kind of housing proposals they deem feasible under their endowment. Whereas UVic and SFU are kind of, again, they have to work collaboratively with the municipalities to make things happen. But again, I spoke about this a little bit earlier. I think it's partnerships with private developers, both on and off campus, that could lead to more success for universities. Because one of the things that we both pointed out from our research is that students don't only want to live on campus, right? Like a certain percent of them, sure, they want to live there in first year, but eventually they want to move out and sort of experience that independent lifestyle. And there's not enough housing on campus or off campus to make that a reality.
I think that social housing or student housing is going to have a real challenge ever being built through completely private means. And I think it's going to need public support. And, most of the people that have assessed social housing have said they need free land from government to make economic sense or huge incentives from government. And I think student housing is much the same. And the endowments, the universities, the land holdings that universities have does in most cases still have land available for residences. And I think you could have public-private partnerships with private developers coming in and building and renting those buildings, but with the universities providing land at either free or cheap prices, long-term land leases, which would reduce the financial commitment for the private developer fairly dramatically, reduce the rent that they have to charge the students, and therefore make it a profitable venture. I think, to be candid, that's the only way you're going to solve the problem for either social housing or for student housing, just because the economic ability to pay rent is far lower. But I do think that the even bigger problem is the very next stage of when you graduate, which is what you're embarking on right now. And I know that the vast majority of students that have graduated that I'm familiar with end up moving back with their parents because it's very challenging to get that first apartment, that first condo, that first whatever, and they're staying with their parents until they're in their 30s, and it's this new sort of scenario that didn't exist when I was a kid, where people are living with their parents after university for a couple of years before they can get started. What do you think about that trend? Actually, you know what? Let's take a break for some messages and come back. And I'm going to ask Julian about not his current student housing initiative, but it's the graduate housing initiative and what he thinks his analysis would be and his conclusions would be, his findings would be if he changed it from studying students to finding and studying, people that have graduated or 2 or 3 years out of university or college and what their challenges are. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Having an interesting conversation, I think, with Julian Wells, who launched a thing called the Student Housing Initiative, and has come out with a major report, second year in a row, analyzing students and the challenges they have to find housing. And I've really enjoyed listening to you and reading your study and your conclusions. And thank you for that. I want to put you on the spot a little bit and ask you about the next couple of years. Most people graduate in the early 20s. I read this really fascinating book about the 20s are the most important decade of your life. And it was suggesting that a lot of people are delaying sort of their commitment to mortgages, to housing, to families, to kids, to marriage, etc., 5, 7, 10 years longer than they did a generation ago. And one of the major reasons why is the challenge of affordable housing. And that therefore kids are, after they graduate, too often having to move back with their parents, and or the only way they can afford is the continuation of what you've described as that family support for the cost of accommodation. And because of that, and other reasons, people are delaying getting married, family formation, putting a down payment on a house, committing to long-term rentals, etc. What do you think of that? Are we delaying adulthood a little bit longer today?
I mean, I think I wouldn't put it as delaying adulthood. I don't think that's the perspective I would take. I think, when you look at people living with their parents or sort of carrying on, basically trying to afford and build up savings wherever possible to be able to either buy a house or save for retirement or do whatever their long-term goals may be. I think that's okay. I think, very much the shift is happening, I would say, as a result of housing. I think that is a major catalyst is, the cost of affording a down payment in a big city, whether it's Toronto, Vancouver, or any of the other big cities in Canada, it's massive. And to try to do that without any sort of financial support from family members is a pretty challenging task. And I think one that a lot of young people would struggle to accomplish unless they're independently wealthy or, selling a tech company for hundreds of millions of dollars. It's a pretty challenging environment. So I think, is it an issue to look at? Absolutely. But it's all kind of linked back to that affordability. It's linked back to the price of housing. And to me, I think the lever that we need to pull to sort of work towards that affordability is aligned with what CMHC has said is building more housing and trying to get 3 million more units by 2030. And I think that's kind of the.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. Oh, I was just going to say, I think that's very much the goal we should be working towards.
I spent last weekend with a couple of early 30s, 30-year-olds. And so they're a couple of years after graduation, more than you. And they were mad. One couple have been looking for a couple of years. They're married, but they've been looking for a couple of years in the Toronto area for a house. And they said the only house we could afford is, west of Georgetown, that there's no house in the 416 and almost no house in 905 that they could afford. And they both got good jobs and making good income. But because of housing prices and required down payments and current mortgage rates, etc., the only thing they can afford is 45 minutes an hour, hour and a half commute time. And they're not willing to do that. So they're staying in a one-bedroom apartment in downtown Toronto, less than 600 square feet. And because of that, they're not sure if they want to get pregnant. And it's delaying the arrival of a family. Other people that were there were saying that they couldn't afford to live in Toronto. They were looking at Ottawa or Calgary, other places to move to. We had out-migration from the Greater Toronto Area in Ontario for like the first time last year, where people were leaving for the United States and leaving for Calgary in the West. We got some problems, don't you think?
Absolutely. I mean, I think when we look at Canada as a whole, I think the productivity rate is concerning. That's something that's declined significantly. I think birth rate is concerning. That's also declined significantly. I think when we look at Canada as a whole, there are definitely large scale challenges that we need to be solving. Do I want to, come and say that all of these are linked to the housing affordability crisis? I wouldn't say that's the entire driver. It's certainly part of it. And I will come back and sort of hang my hat on that statement of I think supply is the answer. And, for me, I think it's completely reasonable to be frustrated and upset about the reality that we're kind of faced with right now when it comes to the housing market. It's really challenging to find a place to live. It's really challenging to afford housing. And for that to be influencing decisions about your life long term, it makes sense. But should it? No. I mean, housing is something that people should be able to access.
So how do we
Full
increase
stop.
supply dramatically?
I think there's a lot of different mechanisms we can look at. And, I will point again to sort of what I noted about BC, where they've taken a bunch of different policies and kind of thrown as many as they can at the wall. And I'm sure some will have some impact, some will have probably very little impact. But maybe together, all of these policies will move the needle. I think a big one is upzoning. I think we've seen that kind of across the country where we've sort of started to shift away in the metropolitan areas from this idea of a single family home being where people want to live long term and look to create more sort of uh, missing middle type housing. I think missing middle is something that can be created to, again, support density in communities long term. But there's that challenge of people who are building these homes being able to make things pencil. And one of the things that I would point to in Toronto specifically, in the last 6 months, development cost charges rose by like 40% year over year in Toronto and were quietly raised again at the beginning of June. And these were just on condos. But I think, again, as I said, we need all kinds of housing coming to market. And when we look at condos specifically, a lot of developers view these cost charges as kind of taxes. And based on the economic concepts, they're passing along these taxes to the consumers who are buying the apartments. So I think, if there were a way where cities could work together with developers to kind of lower these development cost charges, perhaps in agreement where the developers would agree to lower the price of their units $1 for every $1 of tax cutoff. I know a couple of developers who are open to that and are releasing a letter to the government suggesting something similar. That could be something that would move the needle. Again, right now, housing, specifically condos on the market, are very expensive, and there's a lot sitting empty and vacant on the housing market in Toronto. Perhaps there could be a way to drive down costs by lowering development cost charges, and the city could look to other sources to increase tax revenue. That's I'm not again like one of the thousands of solutions I think you could look to, but like I said, it's kind of a combination of as many efforts as you can, whether it be upzoning, whether it be decreasing development cost charges, or a plethora of other things. We need to start doing more.
So let's talk about development fees for another second then. One point of view is that growth should pay for growth, and that as you build new buildings, build new homes, there's going to be a need for, water, sewer, electricity, libraries, police station, fire stations, roads, etc. And so therefore that new growth should pay for that new growth. And that was the original justification for development charges, and arguably still is the justification for development charges. The other side would be it is a completely unfair, regressive taxation paid for by the least advantaged in our society, young people, foreigners that are moving to our city, newcomers that are coming to our communities, renters that want to buy homes, etc. And that the whole community knows that it needs all those things, and that this should be a social infrastructure, physical infrastructure funded by the whole community rather than just the newcomers that come to a community. Where do you land on those two different points of view?
I I kind of take the approach of being less sort of black and white and more in the gray as opposed to one side or the other. I like to kind of split it down the middle and see them more as contextual and situational. I think in certain situations you can make the justifications for larger development cost charges, and in other situations, perhaps like the one we're in now, where we're facing a pretty significant housing crisis, we need to be doing everything that we can to make it as easy as possible for people to build housing. And for me, like I've mentioned, and I'll continue to say this, right? We need non-market housing, we need market housing, we need luxury housing, we need condos, we need rentals. We need as many kinds of housing as possible. We even need hotels. We need as much housing as possible. And, I think to a certain extent, when you look at development cost charges as a reason or as a strategy for increasing infrastructure, it makes sense when you're sort of building out a new community or you're building out a new neighborhood where there may not be a ton of housing already. But as you start to densify existing communities, that's another question that we have to ask. As we densify and as we shift away from single family home communities towards more missing middle or duplex, triplex, small apartment style buildings, how much increasing infrastructure do we need? Like, how do we kind of match that densification with infrastructure growth? And how do we continue to, as you said, sustainably fund that? And that's a challenging question to answer. And I think one that should continue to be researched.
So there's been a couple of economic analyses that would suggest that um, our development charges are actually opposite to the cost of growth. And the example was released in Ottawa, where in smaller communities outside of the city of Ottawa, where you do have to do exactly what you described, put in brand new sewers, water pipes, electricity, roads, etc. The development charges are one third of the level within the city of Ottawa, where you could actually access existing infrastructure with almost no incremental infrastructure servicing requirement at all. And so therefore, the development charges are exactly directly opposite to what they should be, because what they are in the city of Ottawa, city of Toronto, et cetera, is a tax. While they may be actually charged as paying for growth in some of the smaller communities. So we need smart people like you to get involved to fix up our system.
I appreciate that. And, I think that's very much my goal long term. I just graduated university this spring and I'm still trying to figure out exactly what is next for me. But long story short, I see that there's tons of problems in the housing space, tons of problems in the student housing space, and I want to be involved in the solution. I think there's tons of opportunities to get involved, and I'm looking forward to kind of continuing to stay in the space.
So what is next for you?
Who knows? Right now, we're continuing to sort of iterate at the student housing initiative. We continue to try to figure out if there's an opportunity to turn this into a sustainable business where I can actually work on something that I find incredibly fascinating full time. That's very much where my focus is right now, is trying to sort of figure out if there's a business here, and is this something where we can continue to provide value to students. I think very early on you mentioned that in the past year we've been involved with housing approvals for almost 4,500 housing units in British Columbia specifically. That's great, and I'm incredibly proud of that, but these are housing units that aren't going to come to market for another 5-6 years, because that's how long it takes to build. And we're in a challenging macroeconomic climate right now where debt is extremely expensive and things are challenging. Like building is tough. So I think with that, we see that the impact we've had thus far is something that will be seen 5-6 years down the line. So we continue to kind of look inward and say, okay, what can we do to create something that brings value to students and brings value to stakeholders today and tomorrow and in the next couple of years, as opposed to really focusing on 5-6 years out.
Well, just as an idea, I'd suggest you think about the graduate housing initiative, because I think that is an even bigger problem. I interviewed a guy from BC who runs an organization about intergenerational inequity. And he was suggesting that this is the most inequitable situation that's ever existed, that every generation in the past has passed down to the coming generation a better future. And our current generation is passing on to the next generation a worse future. And he would suggest it's because of high levels of debt, high levels of taxation, very high levels of housing prices and affordable housing. And he would argue, unemployment that's going in the wrong direction, and AI that might be destroying some of those entry level jobs. And so he suggested that we even have a risk of civil strife. What do you think? Could it be that bad?
Oh, that's a tough question. I would say, I don't know that there's a risk of civil strife at the current moment. It's again long term tricky to see exactly what the political climate will look like across the country. I think there's always going to be some form of disagreement. I think our society has continued to get a tad more radicalized, which isn't the most helpful to having productive conversations about how to improve things in our country. But at the same time, I do think it's fair to say that there's a lot of problems right now. And, I do certainly feel, as I kind of set out on the next stages of my life, whatever those will look like, that I'm in a tricky spot compared to those who may have come before me 30 years ago or however many years ago. I often have conversations with my parents or their friends about, how they afforded university or how they paid for housing when they were in school. And the reality was, tuition was $500 a semester, $1,000 a semester, $2,000 a semester. It was a lot less than it was right now. And housing, the exact same. I mean, I think again, it's all kind of comes back to that housing unaffordability. And when we look at how income has grown over the last 30 to 40 years and compare that to how the price of housing has changed, one has grown far faster than the other, and the income is not the one that's growing quickly. So I think, there's a lot of problems that we need to address for sure.
If you're successful in dramatically increasing supply, and bringing house prices down. Your parents' net worth in their existing home equity is going to go down. What do you say to your parents and people of my generation when you're arguing effectively to dramatically increase supply, negatively impact the current value of homes, the price of homes, and thereby take away the nest egg that I've created in my home equity?
It's a great question, and I think there's not a fantastic answer to be given, quite frankly. But what I would say is this: I think as we kind of shift, especially for those people who own homes and land in the urban centers, as we shift from single family homes to more dense apartment style living, I think there's opportunities for people who own housing to really get creative and really say, okay, how can we be a part of this change? How can we take our single family home and maybe downsize the amount of space we ourselves need and create rental units within it for other people? Because the reality is, as cities start to shift away from single family homes, someone will start to make that transition. So the question I ask myself and the question I ask my parents is, why shouldn't it be the person who's built up the home equity, who makes that rent every month, and who kind of increases the value of a home by changing it from a single family home to a cash flowing asset? Why shouldn't it be the families who have built up equity?
I think it's a good answer. I think the other answer, which you with your economics background should think about how you can best explain this. But it's really, I think a lot of that net worth that's built up in home equity is paper value, because the reality is you may feel like you've made $1 million or whatever it is with appreciation on your home. But if you're then going to move out of that home and buy another home, that other home is overvalued by that same $1 million. And so therefore you're taking that paper value and you've got to invest it again in another asset that's similarly overvalued. And so therefore you really haven't made any money. The only time you ever make the money is when you die and you get to pass it on to someone else, and because you don't need to live somewhere. So and they're taking the money and buying overvalued assets. So maybe they don't even realize the value at that time. So it's not a true value increase like it would be if it was in a stock or an investment. It's a paper value, because every other asset that you might move into, and frankly, even the senior's home that you might move into, and the homes that your kids might move into, have probably appreciated to the same amount. And so therefore, you're benefiting from the overvaluation of your asset, but you're costing yourself with the overvaluation of whatever you're going to invest that asset into. Anyway, interesting challenge to try to persuade people that if they lose $1 million or $500,000 in value in their house, they haven't lost money. But they would, because they may have lost $500,000 in their home value, but by definition, they're then going to be able to move into another house that's gone down by $500,000 in value. Anyway, this has been a fascinating conversation. We're going to take a final break and come back with some concluding comments with Julian Wells in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, Saga 960. Really interesting conversation with Julian Wells. Julian, this student housing initiative, if people want to read it, how can they best find it?
Absolutely. You can go to our website, which is www.studenthousinginitiative.com, and navigate to the research page. We have our research from 2023 and 2024 there. So check it out.
Last question. What's it like being named one of the top 30 under 30? Congratulations, by the way.
Thank you. Quite frankly, it's incredibly humbling and inspiring. I think it's the people who are on the list with me have done very impressive things. And not to sort of take credit away from myself, but I look at them and I say, wow, that's really something I'd like to aspire to. I'd love to get to the stage that they're at. Being young, I think there's a lot of space for me to grow, and I look forward to kind of living up to the potential of what others have done on that space.
Well, it's an honor for me to talk to one of the top 30 under 30, and this has been a really interesting report and a great conversation. So thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online, even from the University of Victoria, BC, at www.saga960am.ca. All my podcasts and videos go up on my website, briancrombie.com, and on social media and on podcast servers the minute that they go live on the radio station. See you next week. Bye-bye.